Good evening and welcome to Metro Focus. I'm Rafael P. Roman. The president under investigation. A sweeping new probe launched this week by House Democrats is ratcheting up pressure on President Trump and those close to him, even as testimony by Michael Cohen raises new questions about the president's legal exposure. On Monday, the House Judiciary Committee, led by New York Democratic Congressman Jerry Nadler, sent letters to 81 current and former Trump associates, agencies, and other entities seeking documents and information as it began a new investigation into possible obstruction, corruption, and abuse of power by President Trump and his administration. According to the AP and the New York Times, the new probe could be setting the stage for a possible impeachment effort, something most Democrats have been wary of approaching, at least so far. This all comes as former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort was sentenced yesterday to nearly 4 years in prison for tax and bank fraud related to his work advising Ukrainian politicians, crimes he committed before he joined the Trump campaign. The 47-month sentence is far lighter than the 19 to 24-year prison term recommended under sentencing guidelines, leading many legal experts to say that the judge, a Reagan appointee, was too lenient. And joining us now to talk about the various investigations and the possible jeopardy for the president is Sam Nunberg, former campaign advisor to Donald Trump and one of the individuals who received a letter from the Judiciary Committee this week.
Well, first of all, the committee is asking me to provide information regarding any contacts I could have had or would have had with the Russian Federation about sanctions, with WikiLeaks and the Trump Tower Moscow meeting. It was lined up, the request itself, I think it's like 8 parts. I frankly, Rafael, don't have a lot to give them. Mm-hmm. And in any event, I was going to comply no matter what, because one, elections have consequences. Mm-hmm. And the minute the Democrats won the House, we knew that they were going to have these investigations. Jerry Nadler said it himself when he was the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee. And number two, one of the things I hear from a lot of Trump allies, or they're all saying they don't want to comply with this, or people who don't even receive these letters, such as a Joe DeNova, they're saying you shouldn't comply. Well, they're not the ones who receive these. Yeah. And I don't want to be under suspicion because I did not collude with the Russians. I did not get anything from WikiLeaks, and I have no reason not to comply.
Now, they're also going to ask you about Roger Stone, right?
Right.
I mean, that's what I hear. Now you said that Roger Stone told you that he actually had dinner with Julian Assange, the editor of WikiLeaks, but that you don't believe that that ever happened.
I believed it at the time when he told me.
But you don't believe it anymore?
Well, subsequently, no, because he told me that Julian Assange was going to release information on the Clinton Foundation. They never really released any information on the Clinton Foundation. So everything he told me did not really turn out to be accurate. Now, don't get me wrong, Roger would have loved to have had dinner with Julian Assange. He would have loved to have met him in the Ecuadorian embassy, but he didn't.
Now, he's a friend of yours, right? But some people are saying that he may be the first person ever to be convicted for bragging. Do you think that may be the case?
Well, he actually wasn't charged. You know, in the indictment, he was charged with obstruction of justice, allegedly in lying to Congress. But I think that it goes to whether or not any Americans are going to be part of this conspiracy to defraud America, which was in the first indictment that Mueller got from the grand jury. I don't happen to know, but I do think that the Mueller report will be damning from the point of view of that it's going to say that the Trump campaign and perhaps Donald Trump were willing or thought they were getting these WikiLeaks.
Is that why you said, even though most people think that the report is not going to present a finding of a link of collusion between the administration and Russia, but you said that you think it's going to be a roadmap for impeachment?
It is going to be a roadmap for impeachment. I think that when they impeach Donald Trump, I think they will impeach him. I think what the Democrats are doing is they're trying to take their time. They're trying to present the evidence to the American people. But I think that they have judged, and Congressman Nadler even said that he believes the president has already obstructed justice. The issue that I think underlying for the American people are, one, do the American people want to relitigate the 2016 election? And two, if the underlying crime that they don't have any direct evidence of the Trump campaign or Donald Trump dealing directly with the GRU or the Russian government, then what are you really going to impeach him on here if there's no underlying crime, as opposed to Nixon and Clinton?
Yeah. You know, in his usual understated way, President Trump tweeted that the House probe was, quote, the greatest overreach in the history of our country, and added, The Dems are obstructing justice and won't get anything done. A big fat fishing expedition desperately in search of a crime. He also called the probe presidential harassment. Do you see this probe, particularly from the Judiciary Committee, as a witch hunt? Which even, David Axelrod, the Democrats, say it looks like it is.
David Axelrod said that?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. He says, he didn't say it is. He said, be careful, Democrats, this could look like a witch hunt.
Yeah, I think that's a problem for the Republicans had in 1998 with Bill Clinton. These are legal issues. But what I do think is the problem for the Democrats is that it looks as if this is cooked from the point of view of they already believe Donald Trump committed crimes. And once again, what I would say is if they don't have an underlying crime of Donald Trump dealing with the Russians directly or the GRU for WikiLeaks, not even whether or not he thought he had a contact, but if he didn't do it, then where's the beef? Look, I did not feel that the letter I got was unfair. I think there's executive privilege issues with the other letters, but I didn't get one of those because I don't really deal with the president. I've talked to him a couple times while he's been president, but I haven't talked to him in a long time. So.
Let's talk about Michael Cohen's testimony. It seems like it's a tale of two testimonies. You listen to the Democrats and they say, smoking guns all over the place. This has damned the president. You talk to the Republicans and they say, final proof that the Russian collusion was nothing but a big hoax. What do you see it?
Well, look, I don't know we're going to have final proof until we actually see the Mueller report. What I do see, though, is one, let's talk about what happened with Michael Cohen. I like Michael. I sympathize with Michael. I don't think he was treated ultimately very well by Donald Trump. But what we did find out, Raphael, was that I could tell you he wanted a White House job. He said he didn't. And I don't know if that's material to his testimony. Now we find out that his lawyers had approached the Trump lawyers about a pardon. However, we also find out that Donald Trump, and this is where I think he could ultimately have a problem, was not telling the American people the truth when it came to the Stormy Daniels payment and his relationship with them. I think that the overlying issue is that Donald Trump has an issue, he may be constitutionally incapable of just laying his markers down and saying the same way Bill Clinton did, saying, look, I did certain things I'm not proud of, or I did certain things here, and maybe I should have been more clear about them. However, there's no underlying crime here. He's incapable of doing that. I mean, you even look back to Bill Clinton's mea culpa to the American people. His advisors were even saying that they didn't think his mea culpa went far enough and that he attacked Starr too much. Look, the president has a legitimate argument here, but I think ultimately here's his issue, is these hearings, to continue to do this, I don't think there will be the knockout punch to that 35% of his base, but that's only 35%. And these are consistent, and the president loved boxing metaphors. These are jabs and rib hits, consistently.
So you think it's gonna wound him, even if there's an impeachment and he doesn't get thrown out of office? It's still, all this stuff swirling is going to hurt him for 2020.
It could if he doesn't have the deliverables that he had during his first term to keep the Republicans in check with him. If he doesn't have another Supreme Court vacancy. What you're seeing now is that they're saying that there's going to be an economic slowdown. North Korea isn't going well. So listen, I would say, though, I've worked for Donald Trump. I've been an adversary of his. I endorsed Ted Cruz after he fired me. I was sued by him. Don't underestimate Donald Trump. And anybody that underestimates him underestimates his own power. And we don't know. I think he will make it to 2020. Ultimately, I don't think he gets indicted, but we don't know who he's going to be running against. And I think a lot of those candidates, he's a very good chance to be.
All right. Well, Sam, we have to end it there. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.